So this video is going to cover the layers within the layers. In Objective 3, we're going to look at the layers of the skin and their functions. So remember, we have three main layers. Just to kind of go back, we have three main layers. We have the epidermis, dermis, and hypodermis. Only the epidermis and the dermis make up the skin. The epidermis is the most superficial, the dermis is deeper, and then even deeper than the dermis was that hypodermis, but remember, that's just going to be kind of like a fat layer. It's not actually part of our skin. And so in Objective 3, we're going to look at these other layers that make up those parts and kind of go into more detail. So the epidermis itself actually has 5 layers. And so one way that you can remember these, I did not come up with this on my own, so I can't take credit for it, but I've heard this and it's kind of helpful, is starting with the most superficial layer. You can use the mnemonic device of come, let's get sunburned, which obviously sunburn is not a good thing, but the silly mnemonic may help you remember the sequence of the layers. So come, let's get sunburned. And so we're going to start with the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is going to be the outermost layer of the skin. This is going to be that layer or many layers of the dead cells that are on the outside of your skin. They are going to be very important in protection and preventing dehydration and protecting us from abrasion and microorganisms and things like that. It's constantly being replaced. We're always making new skin cells and they're pushing their way up. So the outermost layer is the stratum corneum. And if you think about what corns are kind of like hardened structures on your skin. And so maybe that'll help you. It's actually from a process of cornification where the skin is toughening and hardening and becoming more keratinized. Next is the stratum lucidum, and this is going to be a clear layer. This is the one that may not always be present in all areas of the epidermis. It doesn't really have a super important function, but it is going to be present in some areas. Then we have the stratum granulosum, and it's named because it looks grainy. There are some lamella granules that are going to be found there, and it's going to be 3 to 5 layers thick. And this is actually the layer that begins the death of the cells, and so the organelles begin to disintegrate, and so from here up, the cells are all going to be dead. Okay. Now our living layers are going to be the stratum spinosum or spinosum and the stratum basal or basale. I've heard it said both ways, so however you want to learn it is fine. But the stratum spinosum or spinosum, it looks spiny in appearance because you have these cells, these keratinocytes or keratinocytes that are held together by desmosomes. And the desmosomes are kind of a type of cell junction. And so they kind of like button the cells together and they kind of give it a spiky appearance between the cells. And so that's 8 to 10 layers, and this is going to be a living layer of cells. And then the cells are going to be produced down here in the stratum basale. And this is the living layer that contains that basement membrane. So we're talking about epithelial tissues here. So remember, epithelial tissues have an apical surface. And so all the way up here, you're going to have the area that's exposed to the outside air. And then it's going to be attached down here at this basement membrane. So that's going to be your deepest layer of your epidermis. Now, all of these layers up here from the stratum spinosum, these are all going to be stratified squamous cells or stratified squamous cells, which means multiple layers of flattened cells. But down here in the stratum basale, you actually have simple cuboidal cells. And these are the cells that are going to be constantly making the new skin cells. They're going to be highly mitotic, so we have the cell cycle constantly ongoing there, producing the new cells. And then as they're made, they're going to get pushed upward into the stratum spinosum. They're going to get pushed upward into the stratum granulosum, and this is where they begin to die. And then they're going to continue to get pushed upward all the way up to the stratum corneum. And this is where they're going to get sloughed off, and this process is going to constantly repeat where you have new cells being made and pushing upward. And so here's a picture of what it could look like. You can look at pictures under the microscope and see the different layers as well. So remember that from the stratum spinosum up, we have stratified squamous cells, these flattened cells. They're actually called keratinocytes. And then down here we have the cuboidal cells in the stratum basale, and that's where our new cells are being made. And so they're constantly being pushed upward. And that's why at the time you get to the stratum corneum, you just have layers and layers of dead cells. So the cells are being made in the stratum basale or stratum basal, however you want to think of it. And these are the only cells that receive adequate nourishment. So remember that these epithelial tissues are non-vascular. They do not have a blood supply. If you notice in these diagrams, you do not see blood vessels, okay? There are no blood vessels that are distinctly in the epithelial tissues of the epidermis. And so the nourishment is coming from the dermis below. And so since the stratum basale are right there near the dermis and right there near the blood vessels, they are the ones getting adequate nourishment, which is why they are living and they're able to replicate. And so as I mentioned earlier, once the cells are made, they're going to be pushed upward into the stratum spinosum and then pushed upward even more into the stratum granulosum, and this is where the cells will disintegrate and die. So from here on up, they're going to be all dead cells. They're going to become flatter and more keratinized, which is that process of cornification. They're going to become tougher and flatter. In the tissues that have the stratum lucidum, they will be present in the palms and soles, and then those flattened keratinized cells are also going to make up the stratum corneum, that superficial layer on the outside. Now in terms of the layers, remember that some places have 4 and some places have 5, and the places that have 5 we call thick skin. And this is not in many places in the body, but it actually has all 5 epidermal layers. You will find it on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, and sometimes like at the end of your digits, okay, like at the fingertips. Now the dermal layer is not as thick here, but the epidermal layer is thicker. Now in this thick skin, you will not find hair follicles or the hormonal type of sweat glands or the oil glands. So you won't, pretty much your thick skin is going to be hairless and not oily. And then your thin skin is going to be only 4 epidermal layers. That stratum lucidum is not going to be there. And so pretty much it's everywhere else on your body. Now it does have a thicker dermal layer. It does have the hair follicles and the other sweat glands and oil glands. So there's a side-by-side comparison. You can kind of see microscopically. Here we have the extra layers, so it makes it thicker. Here we are missing a layer, so it makes it thinner. But remember that the dermis is thicker in the thin skin and thinner in the thick skin, if that makes sense. All right, so the deepest layer of the epidermis would be the one that is going to be furthest down in our 5 layers, and that is going to be the stratum basale. And which one is not found in thin skin? That is going to be our stratum lucidum. All right, we're also going to take a look at the cells that make up the layers of our epidermis. And so most of the cells that are in our epidermis are going to be keratinocytes. I've also heard that said keratinocytes, so however you want to say it. But these are very abundant. These are going to be your flattened squamous cells. They're going to be found in all layers. And the reason they're called keratinocytes is because they make the protein keratin. And keratin is a very tough protein that helps provide structure and hardness. It also helps make it water resistant. We have some Langerhans cells. They can be found in all layers, but typically they're found above that stratum basale, starting in the stratum spinosum. And so they can be found in all layers though, and these are actually an immune cell. They're a cell called a macrophage, and what they do is they go around and they engulf pathogens that are trying to invade, and so they help protect us. You've got Merkel cells, which are going to be in the stratum basale, and these are going to be one of those touch receptors that we mentioned in video 1. They're kind of right here in that bottom layer. And then we also have melanocytes. Melanocytes are what give the skin its color. They produce a pigment known as melanin. They also have a very important protective function, which they protect us against UV radiation. They kind of protect the nuclei of these keratinocytes, and you will find them in the stratum basal or basale as well. Now, these melanocytes actually are what we call dendritic cells. They have dendrites that kind of extend upward, but the cells themselves are down here in the stratum basale. So this is just a couple more images to show you the different cells that you can find in the epidermal layers. You need to be familiar with the cells and their functions. And so which cells are only found in the stratum basale? Okay, there were 2. That was the melanocytes that produce melanin, and the Merkel cells that are touch receptors. The A and C are both going to be present in the other layers as well. Number 2, which cells of the epidermis is involved in sensory input? So keratinocytes produce keratin. They're just pretty much the bulk of the skin. The Langerhans cells were an immune function. Melanocytes produce melanin, and so the answer is D. The Merkel cells were a type of touch receptor, so that would be sensory input. All right, which layer is undergoing rapid mitosis? That is going to be the stratum basale. That's where the new cells are being made. Remember, it's the only tissue that's nourished enough because it's close to that dermal layer where the blood vessels are. And which layer is made up of cells where the organelles have disintegrated? That starts happening in the stratum granulosum, and that's when you start to have dead cells in your layers. All right, so next is the dermis. Now the dermis only has 2 layers. It has the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis. And the dermis is also going to be made of connective tissue. So where our epidermis was going to be epithelial tissue, our dermis is going to be connective. And so it's in this layer that we have the blood vessels, we have a lot of your nerves, the hair follicles, and some more touch receptors and sweat glands. A lot of your accessory organs are going to be found here in the dermis. And so the papillary dermis is the most superficial layer of the dermis. It's about 20%, and it's made of areolar connective tissue, which is kind of a loose fibrous tissue. It's not super compact, and you're going to find this in these little projections called dermal papillae. Okay, so you can see here that they're kind of like little finger-like projections, and it has to do with the connections between the epidermis and the dermis. So the way they're connected, it creates these little extensions called the papillae. It also increases surface area. So anytime you have foldings or extensions like this, it increases surface area. And that's actually going to make it a tighter, more well-bonded connection between your dermis and your epidermis. There's more room for that connection. Now within the papillary dermis, you're going to have lots of little blood vessels known as capillaries. And this is where you have that nutrient exchange between the dermis and the epidermis. So its main function is to provide those nutrients and oxygen to those epidermal layers above. And then the lower portion, about 80% of the dermis is the reticular dermis, and this is where you're going to have the dense irregular connective tissue. You're going to have lots of fibers like elastin and collagen, and they're going to provide elasticity, strength, and then the collagen actually binds water, so it helps to keep the skin hydrated as well. This is also where you're going to find most of those skin appendages like the hair follicles and the glands, the oil glands, sweat glands. And then we have our final layer, which was that subcutaneous, which means below the skin, or the hypodermis. Remember, this is not part of the skin, but it does have important functions in terms of the integumentary system. It's mostly composed of adipose, and then there's going to be some protein fibers as well. So we have adipocytes, or those fat cells, and they're going to store energy, store fat. There's going to be fibroblast cells that are going to create these fibers. And there's also going to be some immune cells called macrophages. And so this subcutaneous tissue is going to also supply the deeper tissues like bone and muscle with some blood and nerves. So it's going to function as padding and insulation. We need that fat to help keep us warm. We also need it just to kind of serve as like a shock absorber. Because it's a fat, it can be an energy source. It can store a lot of your body's lipids, which we can break down for energy when we need to. And so most of the adipose, it really just depends on several factors. It can depend on age. You may have heard the term baby fat before. Babies have more adipose, kind of lose it as we get older. Females actually have more fat under their skin than males do. And then of course your diet can determine how much fat you have under your skin. All right, so question 5, the papillary dermis is made of what kind of tissue? Stratified squamous, that was going to be your upper epidermal layers. Adipose is going to be your hypodermis. Dense irregular is the reticular layer of the dermis, but the papillary is made of areolar tissue. The number 2, which of the following is a cell type that is not found in the hypodermis, and that is going to be melanocytes. These are going to be your melanin-producing cells in the stratum basale of the epidermis. But you will find the immune cells, the fiber-producing cells, and the fat cells. All right, and we will talk about cancer in our next video.